In the scorching Turkish desert, an archaeological team unearths a stone monolith covered in symbols that shouldn't exist, markings that predict disasters throughout human history with mathematical precision, including events that haven't happened yet. As the team struggles to comprehend their discovery, local villagers whisper about stones that should never be moved and previous expeditions that mysteriously vanished without explanation. When the inscriptions reveal the archaeologists' own likenesses, carved thousands of years before their birth, the team begins to fracture, torn between scientific inquiry and primal fear. But the most disturbing revelation isn't what the stones predict. It's what they remember. What if our civilization isn't the first to reach this precipice? What if we're simply the latest iteration in an endless cycle of collapse that these ancient warnings tried to prevent? The choice now facing Dr. Elif isn't just academic, it's existential. Should humanity know what awaits it, or are some discoveries better left buried beneath the desert sand? The metallic clang of the pickaxe striking parched earth echoed across the Turkish desert, cutting through the oppressive afternoon silence. Dr. Elif wiped sweat from her brow, her hand trembling slightly, not from fatigue, but from something else she couldn't name. A premonition, perhaps. She'd spent 15 years excavating Neolithic sites across Anatolia, but something about this particular dig unsettled her from the moment they'd arrived. The crack that followed wasn't like any sound she'd heard before, not the familiar snap of striking stone or the gentle crumble of ancient pottery. This was deeper, more resonant, as if something large had shifted beneath them. The entire excavation team froze. "Stop," Elif commanded, her voice strained. "Everyone back." The workers stepped away as sand began to slide like a theatrical curtain, revealing the edge of a massive grey stone block, larger than a human body. The surface wasn't rough like natural rock, but smooth, deliberately shaped by human hands. And then they saw them, symbols etched deep into the stone, arranged in methodical patterns, unlike any known ancient script. Bahar, the young graduate student operating the camera, zoomed in on the strange markings, her hands visibly unsteady. Through the viewfinder, she captured expressions transforming from scholarly curiosity to something darker: confusion, unease, and for some, unmistakable fear. "Dr. Kaya, what language is this?" asked Ahmet, the junior archaeologist, his voice barely above a whisper. Elif didn't answer. 20 years of fieldwork had acquainted her with every proto-writing system from the region: cuneiform, Luwian hieroglyphs, Proto-Sinaitic script, but these markings belonged to none of them. They appeared systematic, deliberate, with recurring patterns that suggested they weren't mere decorative elements. Ibrahim, one of the seasoned excavators, reached forward, drawn by an inexplicable impulse. His fingertips brushed against the deeply carved grooves. "Ah!" he jerked back, cradling his hand as if burned. "It's hot. The stone is hot." The desert temperature had been hovering around 104 degrees West all day, but the stone should have been cool beneath the sand. Several team members exchanged nervous glances. The wind picked up suddenly, swirling dust into miniature cyclones around the excavation site, as if the desert itself were responding to their discovery. On the horizon, dark clouds gathered, though the forecast had predicted clear skies. The encroaching darkness seemed unnatural, too rapid, too focused above their location. "Get more lights," Elif ordered, her scientific mind refusing to acknowledge the primitive fear creeping up her spine. "And prepare to extract the block, carefully." As the team assembled portable floodlights, Elif knelt before the stone, studying the markings with her magnifying glass. The symbols weren't random. They followed a sequence, almost like instructions or records. In her 20 years of archaeological work, she'd never felt such conflicting emotions when facing an artifact: scholarly fascination battling with a visceral sense of foreboding. By nightfall, the excavation site blazed with artificial light, creating sharp shadows that seemed to make the symbols shift and change. The team had rigged a pulley system to carefully raise the stone block. As it slowly emerged from its ancient resting place, new lines of inscriptions became visible along its base. "These look like numbers," Mehmet Demir, the team's linguist, murmured, crouching beside Elif. His fingers hovered over the markings without touching them. Or dates, perhaps. They repeat in cycles. A younger researcher leaned in, cleaning away centuries of compacted sand with a soft brush. Some of these configurations appear astronomical, he said, his voice tight with excitement. Star alignments, solar eclipses, maybe. Elif nodded, watching as more of the stone's surface was revealed. The careful brushwork exposed a final set of symbols at the base, symbols that made her blood run cold. She glanced at Mehmet, whose face had drained of color. "That can't be possible," he whispered. The newly exposed sequence appeared to represent the current year, not the year of some ancient dynasty or forgotten calendar system, but their year, the present. The desert night suddenly felt arctic. A heavy silence descended upon the team as they struggled to process what they were seeing. The implications were either mundane, a hoax or coincidence, or something far more disturbing. The logical explanations felt hollow, even as they formed in Elif's mind. Above them, the gathering clouds completely blotted out the stars. No one spoke as a cold wind swept across the excavation site, extinguishing several of their lanterns. In the sudden semi-darkness, the carved symbols seemed to pulse with an inner light, a trick of the shadows, Elif told herself, nothing more. But deep in her core, where scientific certainty gave way to primal instinct, she knew they had uncovered something that would change everything, not just archaeological records or academic theories, but perhaps the very understanding of human history itself. As the remaining lights flickered in the strengthening wind, Elif made a decision that would alter the course of all their lives. Rather than reburying the stone as her instincts screamed to do, she gave the order to continue excavating through the night. "Document everything," she instructed, her voice steady, despite the dread pooling in her stomach. "Every symbol, every measurement. If there are more stones below, we need to know immediately." The camera continued to roll, capturing the moment when curiosity triumphed over caution, the moment when they chose to look deeper into something that had remained hidden for thousands of years. Perhaps for good reason. Mehmet Demir's eyes burned as dawn light filtered through the dusty window of his cramped quarters. He hadn't slept. No one had. The linguist sat surrounded by scattered notebooks and reference texts, his desk illuminated by a single lamp that cast long shadows across the walls. Photographs of the stone block were arranged in meticulous order before him, each showing different angles of the inscrutable symbols. He pressed his palms against his temples, fighting the headache that had been building since they'd unearthed the artifact. Something about the markings defied conventional analysis. He could identify fragments that resembled proto-writing systems from Anatolia, elements of Hittite, traces of early Sumerian, but the sequence was wrong, the combinations impossible. "It doesn't make sense," he muttered, reaching for his coffee. The cup was already empty. His third since midnight. What disturbed him most weren't the symbols he recognized, but the ones he shouldn't be able to recognize. Certain configurations seemed to anticipate linguistic systems that wouldn't emerge for millennia after the stone's apparent age, as if whoever carved them had knowledge of how language would evolve. The thought was academically heretical, absurd, yet he couldn't dismiss it. Footsteps in the corridor made him start, heavy, deliberate steps that paused outside his door. Mehmet held his breath, heart suddenly racing. After several seconds, the footsteps continued down the hall, fading into silence. He exhaled slowly, aware of how irrational his fear was. It was just another team member, yet he'd reacted as if pursued. The morning brought the entire excavation team together in the makeshift conference room. Faces were drawn, eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. Dr. Kaya stood before a projector screen, displaying high-resolution images of the inscriptions. Her usual composed demeanor showed subtle cracks, a slight tremor in her hand as she pointed to specific symbol clusters, the tightness around her eyes. These markings, she indicated a series of circular patterns, appear to represent celestial alignments. And these repeated sequences, she moved to another section, suggest cyclical events or time periods. "It could be a calendar," offered Bahar, though her voice lacked conviction. No known Neolithic culture had astronomical knowledge this precise, countered Amit, his earlier whisper replaced by an aggressive tone that made several people flinch. "It's impossible." "Perhaps it's a forgery," suggested Ibrahim, his bandaged fingers a reminder of the stone's unexplained heat. "The erosion patterns and mineral deposits are consistent with extreme age," Elif responded, "and the excavation site was undisturbed before our arrival. This is not a forgery." The atmosphere in the room grew charged. Former colleagues now eyed each other with suspicion, as if searching for someone to blame for their collective unease. Scientific discourse had transformed into something more personal, more primal. "I've found something else," Mehmet said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension. All eyes turned to him. He hesitated, knowing his words would irrevocably change the dynamic. "Some of the date sequences appear to correspond with significant historical events, recent ones." Silence engulfed the room. Elif stared at him, her expression unreadable. "What kind of events?" she finally asked. "Major earthquakes, the Syrian civil war, the COVID pandemic." Mehmet's voice grew quieter with each example. Someone laughed nervously. Another cursed under their breath. "That's not possible," Bahar said, but her protest sounded hollow. Mehmet felt the weight of their stares, some disbelieving, others suspicious, a few frightened. He'd broken an unspoken pact by saying aloud what some had already suspected. "There's one more thing," he added, nearly whispering now. "There's another date sequence, not from the past." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. "It's for something that hasn't happened yet." The road to Harran stretched before Elif, like a pale ribbon across the desert landscape. Ancient mounds rose in the distance, archaeological sites yet unexplored, while dust devils swirled across barren fields. The silence in the jeep was oppressive. Neither she nor Mehmet had spoken since leaving the excavation site. Harran wasn't just another Turkish village. It was one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in the world. Its distinctive beehive houses, constructed from mud brick, had sheltered generations for thousands of years. If anyone might have knowledge about their discovery, it would be here, where history wasn't relegated to museums, but lived in daily practice. They parked at the edge of town. The narrow streets couldn't accommodate vehicles, a reminder of how little had changed since Abraham supposedly passed through these same pathways millennia ago. Elderly men sat in doorways, watching the archaeologists with unreadable expressions. "We should speak with Hamid first," Elif said, nodding toward a small tea house. "He's the oldest resident and knows every story about this region." The tea house interior was cool and dim. Hamid sat alone in the corner, ancient fingers wrapped around a small glass of tea. His eyes, milky with cataracts, tracked their movement with surprising precision. "Dr. Kaya," he greeted in Turkish, "you've come about the stones." Not a question, a statement. Elif felt Mehmet stiffen beside her. "What do you know about them?" she asked, sliding onto the bench across from Hamid. The old man sipped his tea before answering. "Every child in Harran learns not to disturb what is buried near the desert's edge, the stones that should not be moved." "Why shouldn't they be moved?" Mehmet pressed. Hamid's weathered face creased further. "The stories vary. Some say they hold back destruction. Others say they contain warnings. But all agree, those who reveal what was hidden are marked by the earth itself." Elif maintained her professional skepticism. "These are just local superstitions, surely." "Perhaps." Hamid's clouded eyes fixed on her face. "Yet your team is not the first to find such stones. Others came before. They too dismissed our warnings." "What happened to them?" Mehmet asked, leaning forward. "They disappeared. Their equipment remained. Their notes vanished." Hamid's voice dropped lower. "Some say they buried everything again and fled. Others say the desert reclaimed them." The conversation yielded little concrete information, but as they walked through Harran's winding streets, visiting other elders, a consistent narrative emerged. The stories, though wrapped in superstition, contained disturbing echoes of their discovery: circular stone formations, inexplicable markings, warnings of cycles. As evening descended, Mehmet decided to explore further while Elif met with a retired archaeology professor who lived in the village. The narrow streets grew darker, shadows stretching between the beehive houses. He felt watched. The sensation of eyes following his movements prickled the back of his neck. Footsteps sounded behind him, soft, deliberate. When he turned, he caught only the flicker of a shadow disappearing around a corner. His heart raced as he quickened his pace, suddenly aware of how isolated he was. The sensation followed him back to their lodging, a small guest house at the village edge. When he entered his room, he knew immediately something was wrong. His field journal lay open on the desk, pages disturbed. The precise arrangement of photographs had been altered. One was missing entirely, the close-up of the central stone's dating sequence. Nothing else had been touched, no valuables taken. Only his notes violated, examined by unknown hands. The intruder had known exactly what to look for. When Elif returned, her face was ashen. The professor had shown her Ottoman-era documents referencing similar discoveries, all mysteriously abandoned, all systematically erased from official records. "Someone doesn't want this found," she whispered. Meanwhile, back at the excavation site, the team had uncovered more stones. The geometric pattern was becoming clearer. A perfect circle of massive blocks, each bearing similar inscriptions. But it was the content of these markings that chilled them to the bone. Each stone appeared to document a specific catastrophe, from ancient floods to modern disasters, as if cataloguing the darkest chapters of human existence. And at the circle's center, still mostly buried, lay something larger, a monolithic structure deliberately hidden from the world above. The excavation team stood in a tense semicircle around the central pit. Morning light cast long shadows across the exposed stone circle, the air sharp with anticipation and fear. 3 members had already requested transfers back to Ankara. The remaining crew wore the hollow-eyed look of people pushed beyond rational explanation. "We should stop," Bahar said, breaking the silence. "Fill it in and leave it buried." "That's not what archaeologists do," Elif countered, though her voice lacked conviction. She hadn't shared everything she'd learned in Harran, the disturbing pattern of vanished expeditions, the systematic erasure of records. Some truths felt too heavy to speak aloud. "We're scientists, not superstitious villagers," Ahmed added, but his forced bravado rang false. No one had missed how his hands trembled during breakfast. The decision to excavate the central monolith passed with reluctant nods rather than enthusiasm. Each team member understood they were crossing a threshold, professional, perhaps psychological, from which there might be no return. They worked with methodical precision, removing sand layer by layer from around the massive central stone. Every shovelful revealed more of its surface, a monolith larger than any they'd uncovered, its face carved with deeper, more intricate inscriptions. The workers moved with funeral solemnity, their usual chatter replaced by labored breathing and the scrape of tools against sand. Each strike of metal against earth seemed to reverberate longer than physics should allow. Elif found herself counting heartbeats between sounds, a meaningless ritual to maintain control as rational certainty eroded beneath her feet. By midday, they had exposed the upper third of the monolith. The desert heat was suffocating, yet goosebumps prickled along Elif's arms as she examined the newly revealed symbols. Unlike the outer stones, which documented disasters, these appeared to tell a sequential narrative, a story written in forgotten language. "Water!" croaked Hassan, one of the local workers. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor. "I need—" He collapsed before finishing, body crumpling into the sand. 2 team members rushed to his side as he gasped for air, eyes rolling back. "Heat stroke," someone suggested. "The temperature's only 93 today," Mehmet replied, too quietly for most to hear. His gaze remained fixed on the stone. They carried Hassan to the medical tent, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with unspoken dread. Half the team wanted to attribute his collapse to natural causes: dehydration, exhaustion, anxiety. The other half seemed unable to dismiss the timing, the location directly beside the monolith. "We continue," Elif ordered, her scientific resolve wrestling with mounting doubt. Carefully. As more of the monolith emerged from the sand, Mehmet remained fixed at its base, transcribing symbols with feverish intensity. His academic training battled with growing conviction, that the inscription described something impossible, a process of revelation that seemed to anticipate their very actions. "These markings," he muttered to Elif when she approached, "they're describing excavation." "Our excavation?" "That's impossible," she replied automatically, but her certainty had worn thin. "Look at this sequence." His finger hovered above a particular section. "It depicts burial, discovery, and exposure, exactly as we're doing now, as if whoever carved this knew we would find it." "Coincidence," Elif insisted, but the word sounded hollow even to her ears. By sunset, they had cleared the entire face of the monolith, though its base remained buried. The artificial lights cast harsh shadows across its surface, making the symbols seem to shift and writhe. It was Elif who noticed the difference in the central inscriptions. While the outer edges contained astronomical symbols and disaster chronologies, the center depicted something else entirely, row upon row of human figures, arranged in what appeared to be generations. The sequence stretched across millennia, ending with isolated figures that seemed eerily specific. The final row showed only a handful of human forms, positioned in a semicircle, like their team, standing exactly as they were now. The realization passed through the group like an electric current. No one spoke, no one needed to. Each recognized their own position in the ancient carving, a prediction made thousands of years before any of them were born. The impossible had been carved in stone, waiting for them to witness it. Breakfast in the camp's makeshift dining tent became the first casualty of their disintegrating unity. What had once been a communal table now fragmented into isolated clusters, conversations hushed, eyes averted. The discovery of their own likenesses on the monolith had severed whatever remained of professional detachment. "We need to report this to the ministry," Ahmet insisted, addressing his remarks to the small faction that had gathered around him. "This site requires a larger team, more resources." "And say what exactly?" Bahar challenged from across the tent. Her usual measured tone had sharpened to something brittle. "That we found prehistoric carvings predicting our arrival. They'll shut us down and question our competence." "Perhaps they should," a technician muttered. 3 people nodded in agreement. Elif watched from the periphery, cataloguing the shifting allegiances. The team had cleaved into distinct groups, those who wanted to continue excavating regardless of consequences, those who advocated for immediate closure and departure, and the growing number who simply wanted to distance themselves from whatever was happening. The atmosphere had transformed into a psychological battlefield where former colleagues viewed each other with suspicion. When Hassan, now recovered but visibly shaken, dropped a metal tray, 2 people flinched as if shot. The desert heat outside seemed preferable to the suffocating tension within. Mehmet hadn't appeared for breakfast. Elif found him in his quarters, surrounded by scattered papers covered in frantic handwriting. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, his normally meticulous beard now unkempt. Pages from his journal had been pinned to the walls, creating a disquieting collage of symbols and annotations. "You haven't slept," she observed. "I've been translating." His voice had a distant quality, as if part of him were elsewhere. "The symbols are forming patterns, mathematical sequences that correspond to disaster cycles." She stepped closer, examining his work. The neat, precise handwriting of a trained linguist had deteriorated into cramped, urgent scrawls. Some sections contained strings of numbers arranged in spirals. Others held fragmented sentences that trailed off mid-thought. "Mehmet, you need rest. Don't you see?" He gestured wildly at the papers. "These aren't just historical records, they're predictive algorithms. Each stone documents a specific category of human calamity, war, disease, environmental collapse, and maps their recurrence throughout history." The methodical scholar she had known for years had vanished, replaced by someone balanced on the edge of obsession or insight. The line between the two had begun to blur. "We should discuss this with the team," she suggested carefully. "The team?" Mehmet laughed, a sound without humor. "Half of them want to bury everything and pretend we never found it. The other half are too afraid to acknowledge what we're actually seeing." She couldn't entirely disagree. The rational framework of archaeological methodology was crumbling around them, leaving each person to navigate the implications alone. Science offered no protocol for this situation. That afternoon, a violent argument erupted at the excavation site. Two researchers nearly came to blows over whether to continue exposing the monolith's base. Security had to intervene, physically separating the men. Colleagues who had collaborated for years now viewed each other as obstacles or threats. The local workers watched from a distance, their expressions a mixture of vindication and fear. 3 more requested permission to leave, claiming family emergencies. No one believed their excuses. No one stopped them either. Dinner that evening was a silent affair. The communal table sat empty while people ate in their quarters or in small protective clusters. Conversation, when it occurred, focused on mundane details: equipment maintenance, weather forecasts, anything to avoid acknowledging the psychological fault lines spreading through the camp. Near midnight, Elif was awakened by shouts from the perimeter. Rushing outside, she found security personnel searching the darkness with flashlights. Bahar stood trembling in her nightclothes, clutching a digital camera. "I saw someone moving near the stones," she explained, voice unsteady, "taking photographs." The search revealed nothing. No footprints, no evidence of intrusion. But the damage was done. Paranoia, already simmering, boiled over. Some suspected outside interference. Others believed someone within the team was engaged in sabotage or unauthorized documentation. Trust, the essential foundation of scientific collaboration, had completely collapsed. In its place grew something darker, a psychological terrain of suspicion, fear, and isolation that mirrored the ancient warnings carved in stone. That night, as Elif lay awake listening to the wind against her tent, she confronted a disturbing realization. The true excavation wasn't happening in the desert sand, but in the eroding stability of their minds. The University of Şanlıurfa's archaeological archives occupied the basement of a century-old Ottoman building. Unlike modern research facilities with their sterile fluorescence, here leather-bound volumes and metal filing cabinets created narrow corridors beneath amber light. Elif moved through the space with practiced efficiency, her academic credentials earning her access to records normally restricted. She had come seeking historical context, any documentation of previous discoveries that might explain their own. The archivist, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, led her to a section labeled Southeastern Anatolia Excavations, 1920-1985. "Most researchers request digital copies," he remarked, unlocking a cabinet. "I prefer original documents," Elif replied. What she didn't say: digital records could be altered, redacted, erased. Paper retained its secrets more reliably. For hours she examined expedition reports, cross-referencing locations against their own site coordinates. Most contained standard archaeological data: pottery fragments, burial sites, settlement patterns. But occasional gaps appeared in the chronology. Expeditions that began with detailed documentation then abruptly ceased, their conclusions missing. By late afternoon, a pattern emerged. 3 separate excavations within 20 kilometers of their current site had been mysteriously abandoned. Each began with promising findings, then disappeared from the academic record with vague justifications about unstable terrain or insufficient funding. In a folder dated 1974, she found a partial transcript from a field recorder. The expedition leader, a respected German archaeologist named Werner Hoffmann, described anomalous stone formations with non-linguistic markings before the transcript ended mid-sentence. No photographs accompanied the report. The expedition's final status was listed as terminated due to safety concerns. Hoffmann had published prolifically before this expedition. After it, his academic output ceased entirely. A follow-up expedition proposed the following year had been denied permits by Turkish authorities. The justification, handwritten in the margin: site unsuitable for further research, area designated for military purposes. No military installation had ever been built there. Elif photographed every relevant document with her phone, heart racing despite the archive's stillness. The systematic erasure of evidence suggested something beyond academic oversight, an intentional pattern of concealment spanning decades. Meanwhile, at the excavation camp, Mehmet had sequestered himself in the analysis tent. Surrounded by digital renderings of the stone symbols, He meticulously mapped correlations between the carved sequences and historical catastrophes. The patterns were undeniable. The stones documented precise dates of earthquakes, pandemics, wars, and climate disasters throughout human history. His hands shook as he highlighted a specific sequence on his tablet. The symbols clearly depicted the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, the 2010 Haiti earthquake, the COVID-19 pandemic, events separated by millennia from the stone's creation, and then, with unmistakable precision, a final sequence that corresponded to next month's date. The rational part of his mind struggled against the implications. Prediction was impossible. Foreknowledge of future events violated every scientific principle, yet the evidence before him suggested exactly that, unless the stones themselves were recent fabrications, which geological testing had definitively ruled out. "You're not well, Mehmet," he whispered to himself, pressing his palms against his eyes. Sleep deprivation was distorting his judgment. It had to be. But when he lowered his hands and looked again, the patterns remained. Undeniable. Inexplicable. Horrifying. As evening approached, local workers began departing in groups, their expressions somber. No explanations offered, no formal resignations submitted. They simply gathered their belongings and walked toward Harran, leaving equipment unattended in the deepening shadows. The remaining team watched in silence, too fractured to mount a unified response. Some viewed the desertion as validation of their own growing fears. Others saw practical inconvenience, their scholarly curiosity now tainted with resentment toward superstitious locals. When Elif returned from Şanlıurfa, she found the camp transformed, half empty, equipment abandoned. The cohesive research unit dissolved into isolated individuals, avoiding eye contact. Even the physical space had changed, with some tents relocated to maximum distance from the stone circle. She sought out Mehmet, finding him hunched over his computer, muttering calculations. The side of his tent was covered with printouts, disaster chronologies arranged in spirals, connecting ancient floods to modern hurricanes. "Mehmet," she said softly, "I found something." He looked up, eyes bloodshot. "So did I." His voice cracked. "The stones aren't just recording history, Elif. They're completing a cycle." Midnight at the excavation site. The skeleton crew that remained had retreated to their quarters, leaving the stone circle illuminated only by security floodlights. Elif stood alone before the central monolith, its massive form casting a distorted shadow across the sand. The carved symbols, once merely archaeological curiosities, now seemed to pulse with unspoken meaning in the artificial light. She hadn't told the others about her decision to examine the stone alone. Trust had become a luxury none of them could afford. The camp had devolved into factions, each person guarding their theories and fears like precious resources in a time of scarcity. Adjusting the portable light panel she'd brought, Elif positioned it at a sharp angle to the monolith's surface. Her research in Şanlıurfa had yielded an overlooked detail. Werner Hoffmann's final notes mentioned inscriptions that were only visible under specific lighting conditions. The effect was immediate. As oblique light raked across the stone surface, previously invisible markings emerged from the texture, shallow etchings too subtle to be detected under direct illumination. The hair on her arms rose despite the lingering desert heat. These hidden inscriptions differed from the others. While the visible markings documented disasters and cycles, these shadow texts formed complete sentences in a proto-language that blended elements of multiple ancient scripts. Her fingers traced the patterns without touching the stone itself, mentally translating fragments. The message described not divine punishment or supernatural intervention, but the predictable conclusion of each human cycle. Civilizations that reached certain technological thresholds then collapsed through warfare, environmental degradation, and arrogance. The stones weren't mystical prophecies, but historical records, documenting patterns that repeated with mathematical precision. The most disturbing revelation emerged in the final section. These weren't warnings left by gods or aliens, but by human survivors of previous collapses. People who had watched their world end, not through cosmic intervention, but through choices made by societies that believed themselves exceptional, immune to the constraints that had limited their ancestors. Elif stepped back, breath shallow. The implications rattled everything she understood about history. These weren't stones that predicted the future. They were stones that recognized the unbreakable patterns of the past, carved by people who had already witnessed how the story ends. "It's not prophecy," she whispered to the empty desert. "It's memory." A sound behind her, footsteps on sand. She turned to find Mehmet approaching, his silhouette distorted by the harsh lighting. Something about his movement seemed wrong, too rigid, too purposeful. "You found something," he said. Not a question. "The hidden text describes cycles of civilization," she replied carefully. "Human patterns, not supernatural events." Mehmet's laugh held no humor. "Does it matter what causes it? The end result is the same." He gestured toward the monolith. "These stones don't just record, Elif, they complete the sequence." "That's irrational," she countered, though doubt had crept into her voice. "Is it?" His eyes reflected the floodlights as empty mirrors. "What if awareness of the pattern is part of the pattern itself? What if our discovery, our excavation, is the final trigger?" The Mehmet she had known, rational, methodical, grounded in scientific principles, had vanished. This man before her had been hollowed out by obsession and replaced with something feral and desperate. "We need to destroy it," he continued, producing a geological hammer from behind his back. "Break the sequence. It's the only way." "That's not science, Mehmet." "That's superstition." Elif stepped between him and the stone. "These are archaeological artifacts, our only window into understanding what happened to previous civilizations." "Previous civilizations," he repeated, advancing slowly. "Do you hear yourself? You're admitting they existed. Advanced societies that collapsed, leaving only these warnings. We found identical patterns in our own history. War, disease, climate disaster, accelerating toward a mathematical endpoint." His fingers tightened around the hammer. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air. "Step aside, Elif, please." The confrontation froze in tableau, two archaeologists facing each other in the shadow of ancient stones, the weight of unthinkable implications suspended between them. Years of professional collaboration and friendship collapsed into this single moment of irreconcilable division. Elif realized with sudden clarity that the true message of the stones wasn't about future catastrophe, but about this precise psychological breaking point, the moment when knowledge becomes too heavy to bear, when rational minds splinter under the weight of recognizing their place in an endlessly repeating sequence. The final line of the hidden inscription now made perfect sense. It wasn't a prediction waiting to be completed. It was describing them now, poised at the edge of madness and revelation. The storm arrived without warning. Meteorological impossibility transformed into howling reality as sand-laden winds engulfed the excavation site. Equipment toppled, tents collapsed, and visibility diminished to arm's length. The remaining team members huddled in the main research tent, its metal frame groaning under the onslaught. "Sandstorms don't behave like this," Bahar shouted over the wind's assault. "Not in this region, not this time of year." No one replied. They had moved beyond coincidence, beyond rational explanation. The timing, immediately following Elif and Mehmet's confrontation at the stones, felt deliberate, though none would speak this thought aloud. Ahmet pressed his satellite phone to his ear, then shook his head. "No signal, we're cut off." Elif watched the storm through a gap in the tent flap, calculating their options. The desert had become a horizontal avalanche of sand, obscuring the stone circle that had been the focus of their work and their undoing. Her encounter with Mehmet replayed in her mind, his desperate logic, the hammer in his hand, the moment when their impasse was interrupted by the first violent gusts. Then Mehmet had simply walked away, disappearing into the gathering storm. "Has anyone seen Dr. Demir?" she asked, turning back to the group. Exchanged glances, headshakes. One voice suggested he might have reached the equipment shed before the worst hit. Another wondered if he had headed toward Harran. The unspoken possibility that he remained at the stone circle, determined to destroy what they had unearthed, hung in the air between them. Through the night the storm intensified. Sleep came in broken fragments for those who managed it at all. Elif remained awake, her mind assembling the pieces of their discovery into a coherent whole. The stones documented cycles of human civilization, rise, hubris, collapse, with mathematical precision. The hidden inscriptions weren't prophecies, but warnings left by survivors who had witnessed previous iterations of the same pattern. Most disturbing was the realization that their discovery itself might be part of the cycle, the moment when a civilization confronts evidence of its own inevitable end. By dawn, the storm had passed as abruptly as it arrived. They emerged to find the camp in ruins, equipment buried, vehicles partially submerged in drifted sand, the careful organization of their scientific outpost erased. But the true shock awaited at the excavation site. The stone circle had vanished. Tons of sand had filled the excavation pit, burying their discovery beneath a perfect, undisturbed surface. It was as if they had never broken ground at all. And Mehmet was gone. His tent stood empty, his notebook left open on his cot, filled with increasingly frantic calculations and one final entry that trailed off mid-sentence. No footprints led away from the camp. No equipment was missing. He had simply vanished, leaving only the ghost of his obsession behind. "This isn't possible," Ahmet kept repeating as they surveyed the buried site. "We had 3-meter-deep excavations, stone blocks weighing tons. It would take heavy machinery and weeks of work to fill this." Yet the evidence stood before them, or rather had disappeared entirely. The only proof of their discovery remained in their documentation, photographs, and field notes. The decision came without debate. No vote was needed. With the site buried and Mehmet missing, the psychological breaking point had been reached. They would leave, taking their data but speaking nothing of the stone circle's final message. The official report would mention promising initial findings destroyed by an unexpected storm. The excavation temporarily suspended, pending improved weather conditions. Another entry in the pattern of silence surrounding these discoveries. As they packed what remained of their equipment, Elif made her own decision. While the others documented the storm damage, she gathered every digital copy of their findings, every photograph, every scan. Science demanded preservation of knowledge, regardless of its implications. One image remained on her camera, the hidden inscription she had photographed under a bleak light. Looking at it now, she noticed something that had escaped her during the confrontation with Mehmet. The final line of text wasn't complete. It ended abruptly, as if waiting for new information, as if the story were still being written. 3 days later, Elif walked alone through the narrow streets of Harran. The ancient town continued its life unchanged, residents watching her with knowing eyes as she passed. The weight of her decision pressed against her chest, the only surviving evidence of their discovery secured in her pocket. A single photograph of the central stone, showing inscriptions that no one else would ever see. In her hotel room, studying it one final time before encrypting the file, she noticed something impossible. The markings had changed. The incomplete final line now contained new symbols depicting events that hadn't yet occurred. The cycle hadn't been broken. It had merely entered its next phase. What would you do if you discovered evidence that human civilization follows an inescapable pattern of rise and collapse? Would you share this knowledge with the world, potentially triggering panic and chaos? Or would you bury it deep in the desert sand, becoming yet another link in the chain of silence that stretches back through millennia? Dr. Elif Kaya made her choice, a decision that weighs on her conscience, even as she carries the last remaining evidence of what they found. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this story isn't the prediction of catastrophe, but the recognition that we may be trapped in cycles of our own making. The stones weren't carved by mystical forces or alien intelligences, but by human survivors who witnessed their world collapse through the same patterns of war, environmental destruction, and hubris that we see in our headlines today. They tried to warn us across thousands of years, yet history continues its relentless cycle. If this story resonated with you, consider what warnings we might leave for future civilizations, and what messages from the past we might have already ignored. Follow our channel for more explorations of history's darkest mysteries, and share this video with someone who appreciates that sometimes the most terrifying truths are the ones that feel most plausible. The archaeological record is filled with civilizations that believed themselves exceptional, immune to collapse. Perhaps the true discovery isn't what lies buried beneath the sand, but what lies buried within human nature itself.